Hello, thank you for participating on the Zoom webinar today entitled Current Views about Professionalism in the Use of Big Data, presented to you on behalf of the IAA's Big Data Working Group. Some brief housekeeping notes for participants before we begin. First, audio capabilities in electronic chat is not available for participants during webinar presentations. 2, in essence of time, participants are asked to submit questions and comments at the end of the presentations during the Q&A session. A video recording of the webinar will be made available to all those who have registered for today's event and will also be posted on the Big Data Working Group page on the IAA website. I now turn over to our presenters, Bob and Ashleigh.
Hello everyone, I'm Ashleigh Theophanides. Thank you for joining us today. I am the chairman of the Big Data Working Group and am pleased to be joined today with Bob, who will be jointly presenting with me. Some just further background as to who I am. So besides the roles that I play in the IAA, I'm also actively involved as the chairman of the Advanced Analytics Committee within the Actuarial Society of South Africa. I am a healthcare actuary by training, but have been very involved in using data in areas outside of the traditional areas that we would normally work in. So I've done a considerable amount of work in telecoms, specifically in customer value management and the design and implementation of campaigns, but then also in other areas associated with public sector, as well as looking at consumer business. Over to Bob.
Hey everyone. I'm also involved with the IAA Big Data Working Group, which was started in 2016. So it's been 4 years of that group interfacing and doing several things. This webinar is part of the efforts of that working group. I'm also a member of the Academy of Actuaries Big Data Task Force, which is now the Data Science and Analytics Committee. I'm a past president of the Casualty Actuarial Society, and I helped the society start the CAS Institute to develop professional credentials for professionals in insurance data science. I have a special interest in ethics and professionalism and the aspects of professionalism and the use of data science and algorithmic decision systems. Ashleigh?
Thank you so much. So in our presentation today, we will be focusing on a number of themes that we've been able to identify specifically when looking at professionalism. One of the things that we realized as we started performing our analysis of the various journals, papers, and articles is that professionalism in itself is incredibly complex. Specifically in the times associated with the use of big data, as well as the complexity of the different sets of data and how that data can be used. In particular, just looking at Professor Richards and his thoughts around professionalism, I must say I do echo some of his thoughts that as we are able to incorporate more and more unstructured levels of data, as well as using various technical techniques, as well as tools and software that allow us to provide more insights into the various sets of data that we have, identify interesting correlations as well as microsegments. We need to consider to what extent are we still applying our professionalism, and how do we ensure that we allow for various aspects of professionalism in doing our work. Next slide, please. So I think many of you have heard of weapons of mass destruction. I think this is quite an interesting look at the various cases associated with how data has been used, and specifically the misuse of data, and some of the concerns around the unethical design of decision-making algorithms. In addition to that, there's also a German foundation looking at the ethics of algorithms, specifically looking at how this applies across various areas, as well as the perceptions associated with the way in which one approaches these. Can we go to the next slide, please? So one of the first questions being looked at is, what is an algorithm? And for many of us, it would be quite simple. It is the thing that many of us do on a daily basis, and what we've trained to do. But based on the research done, and I do apologize in advance for mispronouncing this, but the institute being Bertelsmann Stiftung, looking at how society as a whole looks at algorithms. 48% of people don't actually know what an algorithm is. And I think, you know, just thinking back to my own experiences, looking and speaking to organizations specifically around how machine learning, analytics, AI, cognitive technologies are being used, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of hope as to how it can be used to drive a better understanding of business challenges, a better understanding of risk. But generally, there is quite a big uncertainty as to how these algorithms work, as well as the complexity and safety associated with those. In addition to that, 74% definitely want more rigorous controls around how these algorithms are being used. And approximately 46% looking at many advantages, but 20% expect that there are likely to be more problems specifically with the use of these algorithms, which definitely talks to aspects of transparency as well as further clarity in terms of how this is being used. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting things that I find is that if we look at perceptions around the algorithms, this is, I don't think, a one-size-fits-all. We see through many studies and surveys that have been done that there is definitely a cultural and social aspects around how data gets used and how comfortable people are with the use of data. We know that, for example, generally speaking, based on some of the research that I've seen, is that in the US, for example, people are more open for their data to be used as long as they get something in return and understand the significance thereof and the rights associated with that. However, looking at this specific study, we can see that there is definitely elements of concern around the use of algorithms and how that could potentially impact them either in a positive or a negative way. Specifically looking at France, finding 21% of them pretty scary, as well as looking at the UK, 25% of those surveyed found they've never heard of what this algorithm is. And then from a German perspective, 28 thinking that there's a concern for manipulation, but that there may be certain elements of efficiency coming in from the use of algorithms. So there's definitely, when looking at these aspects, many positives, but also quite a bit of concern as to how this gets applied and how we consider this. So the reason why we as a working group really wanted to have this session is to give our thoughts and really just entice the profession to think about how we as actuaries can potentially apply our professional adjustments in a responsible way, looking at some of the studies that have been done and some of the thoughts that we have. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, we have identified these themes. These themes each have an extensive amount of underlying complexity that one has to consider. And we will be looking at creating more specific series of webinars looking into each of these things separately, but at a very high level, looking at transparency, fairness and discrimination, governance, education, accountability, and of course, privacy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as we go into transparency, as we saw earlier, that there's definitely concern around, first of all, what is this thing called an algorithm? And the data that is being used within the algorithm, specifically when it comes to using big data, unstructured data, and potentially quite sensitive data in order to drive policy-making processes, and how that transpires from a consequence perspective for individuals, organizations, and even potentially societies. In addition to that, as we know that the level of data that's being created on a daily basis is incredibly significant, and we know that there is a significant theme in data monetization by many organizations as to how can they use this data both for their own purposes, but then when looking at social media platforms and other platforms that engage with broader parts of society, is how does one use that information excuse me, in order to drive outcomes, whether that is to understand vulnerable groups in a particular population, or whether it is to drive an understanding of needs and ways in which one can service those communities from a needs perspective, but then also from a commercial perspective. And as one takes these complex data sets into account and applies them using various techniques and often, autonomous mechanisms of machine learning in order to determine outcomes associated with various drivers, it is often very difficult to explain. And we've seen this quite significantly across a number of case studies, which we're going to be taking you through later on in the presentation, dealing with where there have been these unintended consequences, where these unstructured data sets are being incorporated into various algorithms, and without understanding how the data is being used and consideration of the transparency that may be undermined, makes it incredibly difficult. Often what we also find is that some of the users of this information may not always understand the unintended consequences of the way in which they're performing the modeling, as well as the inherent biases associated with the data that they're using for training their models and the outcomes thereof. So transparency is therefore critical because it ensures fairness and to a certain extent doing the modeling and being able to step back and look at the results in a transparent manner and identify if there are elements of bias is incredibly important, because without doing that, it is professionally quite damaging for us as actuaries, but also for the organizations that are looking to implement some of these interventions. So looking at these results, it's incredibly important to ask the question why. Why are the results coming out of the modeling tools that are being applied in the algorithm producing the outcomes that I'm getting? And is there certain correlations between different data points that is driving an element of bias or unfairness within the results itself? Next slide, please. So one of the first case studies that we are going to be taking you through is on GeoFeeder, which is a social media intelligence platform that associates social media posts with geographical locations. And this used data from a number of social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so forth. And then also looks at social media networks in order to track location and movements. Now, this information was sold to track movement information to law enforcement agencies in order to allow the law enforcement agents specifically to identify protesters and monitor the activity associated with the various activities that these individuals had activities in. Unfortunately, the social media units were not aware of how their personal information was being used, or that law enforcement agencies even had access to them. Looking at these dynamics, makes me think about the balance between societal good and the lack of privacy, or the fact that information may be used, whether not directly, but potentially in time, without the intended individuals being aware of it, or else the intended use may be changed. And I'm thinking specifically, as we are dealing with COVID-19, we know that there is a significant focus on understanding contact tracing associated with various individuals as to how we're getting into contact and how the virus is spread. And for society as a whole, that's incredibly important in order to understand that. But how that information can be used in the future needs to be done in a very responsible way, so that case studies like this don't necessarily unfold in the future. Next slide, please. So in this particular case study, the information was used by law enforcement agencies, and it was only when the American Civil Liberties Union published a report exposing how this data is being used, and citing how GeoFeeder was actually offering these services to these law enforcement agencies, that there was information provided by Twitter and Facebook indicating that they were completely unaware of it, and that they would no longer be allowing them to use their information. And here you can see an actual tweet being provided by Twitter, indicating that they would no longer be providing the information through to GeoFeeder. So again, this does show us how unintended consequences occur without organizations knowing how the data is being used, as well as the potential damage or fairness limitations that may be incorporated by not understanding it. Next slide, please. And this is, I think, the aspects that we need to, as a society, consider, is that as the lack of transparency leads to limit citizens' rights, how does one find that balance and understand the limitations of some of the information that's being used? One of the things that I think we are all quite aware of is the fact that to access many social media platforms and other apps, etc., there is often a terms and conditions that we have to accept. And through those processes, by accepting those terms and conditions, the use of the data can be applied. But many times individuals don't read those. I think there are very few people that actually do read those terms and conditions. But in addition to that, one of the questions one has to ask is that in order to gain access to the app itself, how are you positioning yourself in a situation where your information may be used in a way that you are not comfortable with? And through this particular case study, we're seeing that this misidentification that actually occurred through the use of some of this information, in terms of highlighting certain individuals being potentially in a situation where they may result in violent protests and police encounters, actually result in a number of false arrests. And this is definitely not what I think any of the players involved in this particular case study were looking for, but unfortunately this is how unintended consequences had occurred in this particular case study. Next slide, please. The next one is looking at Amazon recognition, which is very exciting when it was first launched in 2016, where it used deep learning based image recognition services in order to do a number of things, from looking at an object and seeing, you can say, well, this is a dog, and this is a cyclist, and this is a mountain. Did other things such as facial analysis, facial comparison, etc. But again, this fantastic technology was sold to US state government agencies in order to support law enforcement agencies and other private entities. This information could then allow one to provide comparisons between a particular image that you see and one that you either have on your private device, or else helping identifying someone that you have on another potentially warrant list, etc. Next slide, please. Now, what happened here is that, again, through this process of applying this technology, which at its core is a really good technology that can be used to create a safer environment, and that is what I'm sure what the the developers of this solution was looked at. Unfortunately, the way in which the technology was trained was that it focused primarily on white male faces for the training, and therefore when one actually looked at its ability to classify people of color and women, there was unfortunately not sufficient training for that to be successful. In terms of looking at the results itself, and you can see on the pictures that by taking 25,000 mugshots, they were able to run these 25,000 mugshots in order to look at the accurate classification of members of the US Congress, and unfortunately the accuracy of it was not as good as what they'd hoped. So I mean interestingly enough, they had 28 false matches. So here you had members of Congress actually being classified as having criminal records based on those mugshots. But then also, when we looked at the classification thereof, we found that there was a significant mismatch between people of color, where 39% of people of color were misclassified, while only 20% of Congress was made up of people of color. So again, definitely a bias associated with that. And these biases themselves could lead, of course, to individuals being questioned or wrongfully arrested. And the use of this technology was therefore temporarily suspended in 2018. Next slide, please. So I think, as we as a society move forward and adapt technology in everything that we do, in order to bring down cost, make things more efficient and more effective, and one can see how law enforcement is definitely an area where one would want to use as much technology as possible in order to ensure one has a safe society. One has to consider where there are elements of further work that is needed in order to ensure that unfair processes aren't incorporated into the technology itself. And here in this specific case, the fact that the training of the algorithms themselves was very much biased towards white males, that resulted in the outcomes being disproportionately against those of females as well as people of color. And because of this, it is, there are concerns about people being unfairly prejudiced due to this. And because of this, there were certain reassurances put in place that they would inform the public if it would be reapplied. And we know that Amazon has since indicated that they will no longer be providing this to law enforcement agencies, given the concern around various things from civil and human rights, but also concerns around how their software is being used. Next slide, please. So taking this into account, we now move into fairness and discrimination. So, I mean, fairness is incredibly complex, and I think depending on, the way in which one approaches this, we as actuaries, I believe, need to ensure that from a societal perspective, we ensure that we try and adhere to processes of fairness and ensure that discrimination is removed as far as possible. However, with the complexity of this data and the different sources, one has to consider how this is being used, as well as in the design and implementation of the algorithmic processes and systems. How does one ensure that the decisions don't marginalize any particular groups, but then also how does one ensure that it doesn't result in outcomes that result in undue discrimination or unfairness to particular groups, either whether that may be any demographic, either from a socioeconomic perspective or else from a demographic perspective. Can we please go to the next slide, please? So when looking at fairness, there are various levels at which one could consider it. I mean, it's very easy for one to apply it being detrimental at a level, at an individual perspective, an individual citizen and individual recipient of potentially getting a loan or potentially being, having a sentence passed down or else potentially even being able to get a job. But there are other levels that one has to consider, specifically looking at particular groups of individuals or else as a society as a whole. And when looking at these aspects, it's important that we take a step back and consider how the decisions are being applied and if there are inherent elements of bias. Next slide, please. So the case study that I want to take you through now is a recruitment bot that Amazon implemented. As you can see, some of the headlines are definitely not very flattering, specifically calling it a sexist AI tool, etc. And I think, as we look to automate using robotic process automation, bots, etc., and really push ourselves into a more digitally transformed society, these type of things have to be considered in a very deliberate way because of the unintended consequences associated with them. If we can please go to the next slide so we can maybe go through the case study in a little bit more detail. So what happened here was that Amazon looked to take a number of their job applications and create this bot that would allow them to basically rate it. So you could say that, 1 star, 2 star, 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars, and then depending on the number of stars, you would have a prioritization as to who you would want to interview first and who would be the candidates that you would consider more favorably in your recruitment process. And I'm sure many of us, would, when one issues an advertisement for a job position, you find that sometimes people totally misread the script. Funny enough, one of the most interesting CVs that I once got was hiring for an actuarial position, and one of the CVs that I received was for an architect. So I don't know if they thought actuary, architect, same thing, but so be it. And I think in their position, they were probably thinking that, you know, they could use this bot in order to filter out the different buckets associated with their recruitment call that they were looking at. And they basically took data from a 10-year period where they used the applicants and they looked at the people who they hired. And then through that, the system pretty much taught itself that male candidates were preferable. And the reason why that was is because of the majority of the applicants and people fulfilling positions early on were predominantly males. And therefore, within the AI algorithm itself, it automatically put a negative connotation associated with women, and it ended up penalizing any CV that had the word women, for example, in it, and did not allow for it in a gender neutral way. When this was, of course, identified, they had to abandon the project. So these are some of the things that one has to consider when designing these algorithms, is to be able to assess how the results itself can be applied. And as one steps back, is there any results that are being produced that may show a particular bias given the data that's being fed in? Next slide, please. Another case study in particular is the COMPASS one, which is the Correctional Offender Management Profiling and Alternative Sanctions tool. Again, using AI machine learning in order to support judges and courts, as well as parole boards and so forth, in order to determine the likelihood of a defendant becoming a recidivist. And again, unfortunately, the information used in the data points incorporated within the tool itself resulted in the results being incredibly biased against people of color in this particular case. The idea and the concept of the tool was incredibly powerful, where it would allow judges to be able to determine, based on the arrests and the granted bail, as well as bail amounts and sentences, in order to look at science and look at statistics as to how best that could be used in order to assess the likelihood of someone becoming a reoffender, but also what the level of serious crimes that person may commit in the future. So using a machine learning algorithm, especially when there's so many other aspects to consider in a particular case, definitely gives one those data points in order to leverage off. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it didn't quite result in the outcomes that they were looking for. Next slide, please. So based on the investigation by ProPublica, the results were quite damning in that they found that blacks were almost twice as likely as whites to be labeled as high risk, but they actually would not reoffend, while as the opposite was identified for white offenders. In addition to that, the investigation also found that besides incorrectly classifying it between the black offenders and the white offenders, they also found that only 20% of the people were predicted who were predicted to commit violent crimes actually went on to do that, which again shows that the overall algorithm itself was quite produced quite harsh results to the system as a whole, which one also has to consider. So looking at the outcomes associated with this, unfortunately, specifically for people of color, because they were assigned a higher re-offend risk score, it resulted in longer periods of detention, waiting for trial, higher bailouts, and of course, longer sentences. In 2016, the Wisconsin Supreme Court found that they could continue to use this, but did issue significant limitations and cautions in the use of the tool. And I think that one of the most important things I think we as actuaries from a professionalism need to do is to ensure that when people are using our tools and our models, is that they understand the limitations associated with our models, as well as the way in which it needs to be used and the considerations thereof, to ensure that elements of bias and unfairness do not creep into the systems itself. Next slide, please. Thank you. With that, I'm going to hand over to Bob.
Thank you, Ashleigh. I just wanted to mention that we do have a Q&A box that you can submit questions. We've got one question submitted so far. We will address the questions and our responses towards the end of the presentation. I'd now like to talk about a couple topics here that are, where do we go from here? Ashleigh's sort of highlighted the issues around transparency and fairness. And so what are the mechanisms, or what are the areas of attention that we should focus on with respect to dealing with these issues? Obviously, big data, we all know about it. We see how it grows and what its impact is. But let's explore some of the issues with respect to oversight of both the data and how it's used. The mention of algorithms, algorithmic solutions, algorithmic systems, automated decision systems are all impacting us as the case studies that Ashleigh described show us. So the first place to look is for industry standards. Obviously, that would be an area that would be very helpful. We also look for laws, regulations, professional practice guidance that might be helpful. But what we see in this area of big data and algorithms is that they're lacking. They're partial answers to some specific questions and not very holistic. Then we also see either abandonment of practices or the cases that become highly publicized, resulting in some actions being taken against those that use them. But usually it's, as Ashleigh mentioned, the organization simply abandoned the practice. To try to use existing laws and the structure of how laws are formed in various countries, we run into problems because of how algorithms are developed and how they're used. Relying on government is obviously what a lot of people would like to do, but there also are other governance tools, and in particular professions who will be very helpful in identifying and highlighting the adequacy of things like privacy rules, rules for access, ownership, and use of personal data. Next slide, please. So what can we do? What would be good for the benefit of society? So here's some suggestions. One is to find a mechanism to develop a global dialogue, to collaborate, and to use think tanks or professional groups who really understand these issues and can bring some good thinking to the table in terms of how to govern these issues. Some of the issues regarding the regulatory intervention with respect to transparency and accountability, result in just trying to decide who should be protected and how they should be protected. That becomes very much focused on who's affected, and sometimes it's hard to determine that. Also, there's issues around trade secrets, how they're kept confidential, what information is shared, and how is it protected against disclosure of competitive intelligence. The actuarial associations that many of us belong to have recognized these issues and have been pretty proactive in many cases, but we still need to keep it up. That involvement involves getting in alignment with government officials, regulators, and people in the industry, at least the industries we touch, to be part of the discussion, part of the governance discussion and the oversight of these tools. Couple of suggestions. One, something like a algorithm governance forum might be useful, particularly bringing together policy expertise with technical expertise, and to try to develop something along the lines of best governance practice. Another example was to look at, could we use algorithmic systems that would help in holding parties accountable? Basically use the technology for a different purpose, and that is to look at the oversight elements involved in the use of the big data and the algorithms. Next slide. I'm going to quickly just mention the case study about Apple. You can see in the cartoon, the FBI wanted to open it to get information about a suspect in very public killings. They were denied. They couldn't initially penetrate the encryption. So it created an issue between the security of the public versus protecting the user's privacy. Next slide. So what happened was the FBI was able to gain access to the information without Apple's help. And so the case never came to any conclusion, but it does raise the issue of this will certainly continue to happen. Next slide. So the next topic is education. Again, this is an area or a theme of what can we do? What can we do to help the situation and to for the benefit of our profession and for the benefit of the public? Is this just a better way to use data, or is there more to it? So we need to educate. There's a lot of effort going on right now in the last couple of years to bring in data science techniques through actuarial exam system, CPD, and other life learning experiences. We've already seen how actuarial curriculums are incorporating, but much of the incorporation is dealing with the techniques and the methodologies and the modeling. And some of the other information on ethics and professionalism is there. It's just it's not probably maybe not as focused as it could be. Actuaries, of course, are educated to have a certain set of skill sets. And at least in the US and some other countries, the regulators are really dependent upon professionals, in particular actuaries, to make sure algorithms are not discriminatory and that the data can be used and can be actionable by the consumers. We also have to educate people on how to deal with the black box issue. and actuarial decision making can be explained, and the reasoning can be understood without revealing all the inner workings. One possibility is to have some kind of standardization in terms of communication, focusing on the user decisions and a better understanding for those who have to oversee this information. Again, this is education and something that we can contribute a lot to, both within our own profession as well as others. Next slide, please. Moving on to accountability. So for our profession, we've adopted a number of approaches to affect accountability of our work as professionals. Depending on what association you belong to, there are different slight differences, but there's sort of a common thread, at least through the IAA's help, to have a code of conduct, to work towards standards of practice, and standards in terms of who's qualified to do various kinds of work. And also to have a disciplinary and potentially counseling mechanism to help actuaries comply with these accountability requirements. The significant focus in the US and several other countries is to protect the reputation of the profession and to fulfill the profession's responsibility to the public with respect to how big data is used and all of the issues surrounding it. There are high expectations of actuaries with respect to the interpretation of results, the realizing the implications of using big data, and the ability to explain the insights and how this information and is used and how it's gathered and what's the impact on consumers, company management, and other people involved in reviewing it. The main thing in terms of this is it's not going to be easy to get away from needing professional judgment. So going back to education and governance, we need to have mechanisms that help our profession in terms of how they use their professional judgment with respect to big data and the use of algorithms. Next slide. So some of the areas worth mentioning, data quality obviously is a concern. Some of the case studies that Ashleigh mentioned focus on that. The ability to validate various models and algorithms, of course, is very important. And the ability to understand and be able to explain the results of the models. As professionals, we need to be very good at our ability to connect the dots and to do it in a way that we understand, but also that we can communicate. Where there are vulnerabilities within big data and the use of algorithms, that's where we should shine. We should have a good handle on the use of professional judgment and the ability to communicate so that those vulnerabilities don't become the kinds of issues that we have seen already in the public eye. Next slide, please. All right, so one of the ideas here is the impact of different disciplines and how an actuary can contribute when working with a team where people have different disciplines and different professional backgrounds or professional requirements. This will become, it's already important, it will become more important as issues around governing these issues, governing the use of big data and the use of algorithms And it's something that I think is very important in terms of how we work together with others. The education need leads to how we address accountability and how do we express ourselves and express our views in terms of the work we do, so that issues about discrimination, issues about things that may hinder consumers is explained in a way that there's a level of confidence in actuaries as professionals. Obviously, we also have to be concerned about cyber breaches. This is not particularly obviously important for anybody working with data. It's not particularly dealing with the algorithms and the big data, but obviously it can impact how we use data, so we really need to be cognizant of issues around cyber breaches. Next slide. So I'm going to mention quickly a study here about a Microsoft AI chatbot called Thinking About You, Tay. And in this example, there was an experiment in conversational understanding through tweets and various kinds of text messages and others, and to try to develop a conversational of understanding people engaging in casual conversation. Next slide. However, it failed, but it failed quickly. Within 16 hours of opening it up, it very quickly went very bad, and used its technology resulted in inflammatory, offensive tweets and racist comments. One of the issues was the bot repeated just about anything that was said to it on demand. The lesson here is that don't assume a robot or AI or an algorithm will align with acceptable behaviors. It just doesn't work. Next slide. So let me just have some comments on privacy, and then we'll open up for more. Looks like we're getting a number of questions, so hopefully Ashley's following up. I'll be able to answer those. In terms of privacy, some of the main concerns are, and Ashley mentioned this, what are consumers willing to sign or give away or click the box so they can get something for free, and people just aren't as concerned about it. If you don't check the box, you don't get it, so it's very hard to not check the box. And also the realization that your digital life, as some call it, it resides in the companies and that take your data and they hoard it, whether they use it or not, or just store it, it's there. One of the questions is, should compiling large amounts of data be some sort of violation or have some kind of oversight or governance with respect to privacy? Obviously, it would be a big issue. Another question is, should the ability to delete your personal data be a consumer right? Should you have to pay for it? Obviously, some tough questions. Next slide. We can go to the next slide. So one of the case study here is something called My Health Record, which was developed in Australia with a digital medical record to be able to be efficient in storing medical data for medical providers. It had a privacy framework that was copied from one that was developed in England that unfortunately failed and was then canceled because it was selling patient data to drug and insurance companies. This security, obviously discrimination and things that may not be acceptable, such as mental health problems. Obviously, how do we control this? What kind of questions should there be with the unrelated secondary users of data? Who owns the data and what are the obligations? Also, the issues around opting in or opting out, the design of those is obviously widely criticized and something that we need to be pretty much aware of when we're using data. How was it collected? And are people aware of it? Next slide. One other case study was around a Clearview AI. There was a company that was able to take a picture and upload it and cross-reference it against billions of other images. And the photos were scraped from social media. So this is something that's, you put something on social media, it's out in the public, so to speak. But then by scraping it, this AI application was able to pretty accurately identify people and by comparing to other information. Unfortunately, this obviously is done without people's knowledge and can result in issues for the companies that do it and trying to get it stopped. Next slide. So one of the things with this technology was it was claimed that it was okay for law enforcement. Trying to solve the hardest crimes through technology, but the obviously was not only given to law enforcement. It was also became available to private companies and universities, and obviously to make a commercial success of having this technology becomes an issue. Question is solving the crime more important than protecting the innocent and the bystanders? So we're just about at 50 minutes here, so I think I'm going to turn it back over to Ashleigh and try to go through some of the questions we've been seeing. I think we have 10 questions or comments that have come through.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for everyone who has posted some questions. I've kind of picked up a few themes in the questions. So Bob, if I can direct one of the first questions to you.
Sure.
Which is specifically looking at is there scope for the IAA to issue some kind of professional guidance? And if one has to do that, can we as actuaries differentiate ourselves given the professional standards that we abide by?
Well, I think the second part of the question in terms of differentiating ourselves is something that we can look to the IAA and the member associations and the member of this working group to try to bring that information together. As far as the IAA trying to establish some kind of standards, that's a much more difficult challenge. Obviously, we're interfacing with laws and it's vary around the world, and attitudes and what's acceptable behavior and what's expected of professionals varies somewhat around the world. So I think yes, it's partially yes to the second answer, to the second part of the question, but the first part is much more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you. Then another theme that's come through is how can actuaries potentially identify bias, specifically when looking at some of the algorithms and being able to identify that in a meaningful way. Reflecting on some of the sections that you covered, I think you did highlight some of those. But maybe if I could give one or two of my thoughts, and then Bob, I'll hand over to you. So if we look at many of the case studies that we went through, I think my understanding of the people involved and the processes that they went through in developing these technologies is that, there was always good intent. Unfortunately, the information that went in, as well as when the results were produced, were not cross-checked. And I think sometimes as, you know, as professionals, we may be so focused on ensuring the precision, accuracy, and outcomes associated with the algorithm that sometimes if we just step back and look at the results and see whether or not it aligns to what one would expect, and just doing some basic checks, one could quite easily pick up that there were some potential anomalies coming through. So that is often my approach to it, is that, you know, don't use black box technology. Understand what your algorithm is doing, and you know, redo the calculation in simple form to understand the drivers behind the results, but then also take a step back and look at the results, and doing that 10,000-foot view and asking that question that I mentioned right up front is, why is the result being produced in the way that it is often a good way in order to identify potential underlying bias either in the data or else in the results. Bob, any further thoughts on that?
I think just to add another aspect of it is, do we have methodologies, or shouldn't we be developing methodologies for testing bias in the data that we use? Sometimes we have the data, we're trying to see if it fits our modeling concepts, or trying to use the data in a machine learning environment, but we haven't really tested the data to find out what kind of biases, as you say, anomalies, but even some of the biases that you don't want to do huge amounts of work then to find out that the results don't make any sense if you could have done some testing to begin with.
Thank you so much. I see that we have run 1 minute over and a number of people are busy dropping off. So I think at this point, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you attending the session with us. I also want to thank the IAA for their support in setting up the webinar, as well as to the Big Data Working Group and Bob for presenting and putting the materials together. We hope to be able to share more of the themes with you in the future as we do a few more deep dives as the Big Data Working Group, in order to support you as actuaries as we navigate this evolving and incredibly complex environment. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob.